And what you were saying was so good that I started recording. And
This is Jews Talk Racial Justice with April and Tracy.
A weekly show hosted by April Baskin and Tracy Guy Decker.
In a complex world, change takes courage.
Wholehearted relationships can keep us accountable.
I feel like there's this sense that we have as Jews that because of the Shoah, therefore we win the Oppression Olympics. And like, don't you dare try to compare what you've gone through to what we went through, which feels so, I mean, talk about a scarcity mindset. Right? I mean, like, that's really just messed up. And I think it puts us into the wrong place often when we do try to think more broadly about systemic oppression. When I first started on this self-conscious anti-racism journey, and I ended up talking to somebody at my synagogue, and I was really talking about how, like, coming to grips with white privilege and coming to grips with the facts that I have benefits that my neighbors of color don't have. And he was like, look, I'm sorry, you're talking to a guy who's had his ass handed him so many times because he's Jewish. And I was like, what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Does that mean that you can't have benefited from white skin privilege because you also suffered from anti-Semitism? Like, and again, it's that either or, right? Right. I mean, there it is again. There's that white supremacy. And I think it ties into what you're saying about sort of the need to like show it off, right? Like, look at this horrible thing that happened at my synagogue. Look at this.
I see us, right? Like this invisible, like it's, and what you were saying was so good that I started recording. And it was so good. So like, to get people caught up, like I was talking about this, it's sort of a sensitive subject, but that we were actually talking about some metaphysical principles that I'm into, and you had a phrase and that you use. What was your phrase?
I always tell myself and others that we need to move toward what we want and not away from what we're afraid of.
Exactly. Right. And the spiritual principle that I've been taught is that what you focus on grows. I learned this in a mystical context, and also I was so thrilled when I heard Adrienne Maree Brown also specifically use that phrasing. And I noticed that there's a pattern among Jews at times that bothers me. And I agree with the sentiment, but like the basic principle as it relates to fighting anti-Jewish oppression in my mind is that it's like the example of what you focus on grows, and that you should move toward what you want and not focus on moving away from what you don't want, is that by when anti-Semitism arises or when there are things to deal with, and this may not always be the case, but I believe more so than not it is, that it's better to focus on amplifying what is good about Jews and how Jews are just like everyone else, and there are specific ways that we basically just educating people about the universal experiences that Jews share with all other folks, as well as sharing different challenges or cultural specifics and forms of oppression that we face, and informing people about our humanity that is both distinctive and often shared with other groups. And instead I notice, more so than I notice within the Black community, like there's sensitivity in the Black community around if there's a shooting or something to not actually show images of Black death. And that is deeply disturbing and re-traumatizing. Whereas I notice when there are moments of, when there are acts of anti-Semitism that arise at different communities, it really bothers me, because as someone who notices these patterns, because I notice that at times, occasionally my timeline on Facebook or on social media has been filled with all of these swastikas and anti-Semitic images, and it's not white supremacists who are posting this, it's Jews who are aiming to bring visibility, but I think it's the wrong kind of visibility. Because I think without realizing it, some of my folks are intentionally amplifying the hatred and something that could have been contained. So I think that we can get more savvy in our strategy in supporting a local community. I come from a community where a synagogue was firebombed in Sacramento during my childhood, and Like to this day, I'm very careful about suspicious mail because as a kid, as a religious school aide and eventual teacher in high school, as a kid, like we had to be very sensitive about suspicious packages in Northern California and how kids were getting home, which is a thing in general, but there was just like an extra layer of security and nervousness, right? And so I viscerally feel a sense of connection to those real concerns. And so it's all the more, so I think ideally at times when these things happen, it would be really smart for us to find ways to support that community without further amplifying the bigotry and anti-Semitism that we're being targeted by, and instead lifting up and educating and reaching for relationship. I think in part what's challenging about that is that because of the collective trauma that many white Ashkenazi Jews in particular, but also Jews of other ethnic backgrounds too, but specifically what Ashkenazi Jews have faced, trust can be a hard thing after millennia of having trust broken in different countries and different communities. But that is what we need to lean into and actually decide that we do have a lot of allies or potential allies, and let's reach for them and lift up our humanity and reach for relationship rather than going for visibility and actually just giving more visibility to the hate. What's interesting for me is that I think part of that is rooted, like as you were talking earlier, part of it is also, I think part of the trigger, the reflex response to do that, I think is in part, which I do understand, but again, I think it's not the right strategy, is around Jews trying to contradict the invisibility of anti-Semitism and also the invisibility of Jewish pain. There's this, it's so interesting because we aim to have these bite-sized episodes that are digestible for folks, and we're talking about this thing that is like whole
digestible. Yeah,
like whole years of study, like enormous volumes of work. But what I'm trying to say is that I think also related as someone who consistently brings a trauma-informed lens to all the work I do, is I think also lifting it up is trying to say to the world, I am a part of the people who have been hurt and targeted, and I want that to be known. And I think part of that comes up specifically in an American context, because in general, American society has been very selective about what it wants to make visible. It's been open to making the Holocaust visible, but not really open to there being open critique or complaint about anti-Semitism within American society in a meaningful way. It's more like, you're welcome. We eventually, after letting millions of you die, we eventually saved you. And now just fall in line. And just in case you are unclear about that, we're going to pretty unjustly execute 2 Jews during the Red Scare. And we're going to give these subliminal messages that indicate you're lucky to be here, but don't push it. And I think ultimately, to cut to the chase, it's going to take courage and organization and alliances across lines of difference and solidarity. But we actually do need to push it, because that same oppression is tied to that is white supremacy. That is tied to the racism, right? It's all right. And Jews are, and so instead of actually facing that, I think at times some of us end up just actually amplifying the bigotry.
Well, no, exactly. And we fall into that white supremacy culture, that either or again. And I want to give credit, because I didn't put these words together in this way the first time. DeRay McKesson is the one who said that our liberation is, or our oppression is linked and not ranked. Those 2 words. Anyway, but I think that's exactly what you're saying, is that we focus so much on our own trauma, and then we fall into the white supremacy culture of either or, that and scarcity, that we say, if we're talking about our trauma, there's no room to talk about your trauma. When in fact, they are intimately related. The same systems that cause trauma of Jews through systemic anti-Semitism caused trauma of Black folks through systemic anti-Black racism. And once we recognize that they are actually intimately linked, and that we can, by fighting one, we're fighting both, and that there's an abundance of room to fight that trauma, that I think we can actually start to maybe move the needle.
Right.
I have to believe that. I have to believe that we can.
Me too. And I can't see any way that it's not any way that it wouldn't. I mean, for me, interesting, you said, Doreen McKesson said, linked, not ranked, right? And like the nuance of that is that I think overall I agree with that. And I think in some ways, because I hear this a lot, like there's no hierarchy. And sometimes I actually think one that I agree with the linked. I like that, like that they're linked and not ranked. And in some ways I think there are some hierarchies, but ultimately I think it all pans out, but around certain, like if you get into the nuances of different things and the nature of the trauma, I think ultimately all in the wash, it all, what am I trying to say here? And I need to get this right because it's not talked about often, but just basically, I think there's just a lot, one, ideally, there needs to be a lot more education. But I think when people make those kinds of statements, when they do really rank, it's actually because they're not actually informed about American chattel slavery, or they're not actually informed about not only the Holocaust, but about thousands of years about the dozens and dozens of countries Jews have been expelled from, have been murdered in, have been ghettoized within for a very long time, right? And so, it's more that I just, there's so much I want to say here. And so I'm not saying anything because there's so many things I want to say, but like, even if you just look at that people think, look at forms of anti-Semitism now, but you need to, in general, take a longer view and a more holistic view of all of these things. And that, as I'm probably going to mention a ton of times, as Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about in the context of slavery, and I extend that to the Holocaust and other forms of collective trauma, it's not like a group of social workers came in and said, wow, that was really horrific, like we need to get you help because you developed all of these dysfunctional patterns that actually were really smart in the context of the oppression you were navigating, but aren't going to be so helpful.
Right. They don't serve you anymore.
Regular life, like anxiety, like terror, like not trusting, that actually makes perfect sense. Like that's to me some of the challenges in certain ways around some of the ways that mental health gets framed. Is there are certain things that literally are mental health, and there are actually things that sociologically, in terms of social psychology, are actually totally healthy responses to unhealthy, dysfunctional forms of oppression, and that are collective patterns that whole groups of people develop that aren't necessarily illnesses. In some ways, they end up getting classified as illnesses, but they're varying forms of collective post-traumatic stress disorder. And so at times people think Jews are overreacting or Black people are overreacting. Right. It's like, if you actually held the whole picture, you would actually notice that each of these groups respectively are pretty miraculous in how well and how amazingly well they do, despite these horrific traumas that happened. They received where there was almost no one who came in and helped them, where they eventually came in, but not after profound intergenerational trauma was inflicted, and not much help, and often the anti-Semitism or racism continuing after slavery, after the Holocaust, and yet still. And so that's the thing that I often desire when these issues come up or when people want to rank things, is that I just want people to stop this either or battle and this conditioning that we have that keeps us all locked, and move more into a both and.
My grandmother had this saying that I really want, it's like coming up in my head right now.
My friend's grandmother.
It's so funny.
So I want to hear your story. It's really
So
interesting.
actually, I think it was my great grandmother originally who said this. So, but it's been passed down through generations of women in my house where they say, if I cut my finger and you cut off your leg or you lose your leg, my finger still hurts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a really, like, it's important that we have perspective. I mean, I think that I'm getting at this based on some of what you were saying about hierarchy and about the intergenerational trauma, et cetera. Perspective is important, but not to the point of denying or invalidating the pain of the other or of yourself. I think because people do it in both ways.
Right. And at the same, like, you know, and I would like, I think, yes, absolutely. And I'm like, and actually somebody, but also like getting your finger cut, like, yeah, that hurts, but actually isn't the same as not having your leg.
Not the same at all. Right. But that doesn't mean, yeah, absolutely. So that you have to have the perspective and be grateful and recognize what blessings you have. And there's still pain there.
And to me, actually, but again, like what I would add to that though, because like it's, I don't know, was that, because to me in that story, what I'm also saying is I think that oftentimes Jews may say something like that, like this still hurts, but actually what they're saying that's different than say a Christian counterpart is actually without even them being aware of it. They're actually saying this hurts in part because it triggers all these other times where my people have shed blood and died and there actually hasn't been sufficient justice. There was some truth and reconciliation that was very important in Germany, but actually there are literally, like at some point maybe we'll actually go through it. I remember I was once at a training where it spanned this huge multi-purpose room. Countries I didn't even know, like even in my Jewish upbringing, they never actually showed an exhaustive list, probably because it might have been triggering or scary and overwhelming. And when I saw one that I didn't even know if that was complete, countries that I didn't even know had Jews live in them at one point, had murdered or expelled, right? And so like that is to me also what I'm saying, because like the Black part of me is like, yeah, but actually they're missing their leg. But part of the point is that also it's almost as if you could project Black folks, like let's say things start to be more just for Black folks, which right now to everybody, they were nowhere near that, right? But then like if you project out 500 years and there was actually no intervention, healing intervention, they would still be carrying in their bones, and likely in part because of epigenetics, DNA, that unresolved terror and trauma, right? And so to me, that is implied in that statement, because actually, your and the broader oppression in society, that actually like a paper cut actually isn't that bad compared to losing a leg, but it actually, that's the subtext of that they haven't been conditioned the space to feel safe enough to say is, yeah, my finger still hurts, and I mourn the fact that half of my family's legacy is gone, and that I don't feel safe to be fully me, and that I actually come, just making things up, I come from a line of Yiddish communists and or Jews who were amazing social justice leaders who had to go into hiding around that and straightened their hair, and all these different ways that white Ashkenazi Jews were subtly stripped of their identity. And so I think that that explains part of that ferocity around that competition. It's a misplaced self-advocacy for what has the harm that has been done, and some of the self-agency that has been stripped away. And what I would say rather radically is, with education and support and courage, it actually is possible to reclaim your identity in an anti-racist, Jewishly proud manner, and also like acknowledge other communities' pains and the specificity of it, what's similar and what's different.
Right.
I think maybe we can wrap up this episode, and I think it's kind of cool that we just dove in. That's the shows. So I was like, oh, we're doing it again. We're having this conversation that I want. So I'm just going to click record and go for it. And I may share it again because it's like worth retelling. a friend of mine is a Jew from Germany, and she was raised in Germany. I would say her name, but I don't know if she's come with me on the podcast. So, and I'll never forget this conversation that I had with her grandmother. I wish this was a camera or something, but it's like etched in my heart, where there were dancers on TV. Maybe the story's a little blurry now. I can't remember if it was the actual Alvin Ailey Wade in the Water scene. And my friend told me that she'd shared, before I brought it up with her grandmother again, when she was studying Black dance at university with me at Tufts. And she explained, because she learned in college, she explained to her grandmother that Wade in the Water was one of the songs that was used as a way of subtly giving instructions to help formerly enslaved Black folks get out of slavery to freedom. And she said that that's right, that she told me this, and then she shared it with me, and then later we brought it up with her grandmother over tea at her grandmother's house. And I believe her grandmother's Lithuanian, and anyways, my friend shared with me that when she told her grandmother that story, her grandmother started to cry and said, "Why didn't we think of that?" And and my friend said, it's hard to say her name, but, and I said, I asked her if it was okay if I brought that up with her grandmother, and she said it was. And I said, it was different. The oppression was different. Slavery was slow and long, and Black people were enslaved for hundreds of years. I mean, they fought it all along and tried to escape, but it took them decades and hundreds of years to figure out how to do that code, whereas the Holocaust was fast, right? And some Black folks, and in some ways I agree, think of American chattel slavery talk about it as a Black Holocaust. I don't like to literally use that language, but there's a way in which I think at times, anyways, I had this whole conversation with her for a few poignant minutes, and we talked about how they aren't that different, and that they have different distinct. And so I shared with her, like, I hope no group of people could come up with something that smart with no notice, and it felt so sweet to me, and I wanted to cherish that moment forever as someone, talking with someone who was a Holocaust survivor, and hearing us both say, as someone who's deeply steeped in both narratives. Obviously, she's more steeped in the Holocaust narrative as someone who lived it, but I want to be clear about that. But I said to her that it was just different, but it was more similar. But she agreed that it was more similar than different. The difference, to me, in my mind, because lives were extinguished and whole generational lives were cut off, which also did happen in slavery. The difference for me is that they decided it was more in their economic interest to keep us alive,
right?
Like have us work until we were dead, just extended the window, which is still not exactly this, but I think, as someone who spent a lot of, but do you see it? But it was just more like this work camp, because they realized that they could make more profit and build a whole country off the backs of my ancestors. And so I think in a future episode, we should probably wrap up, and it's the call to prayer now. But we should probably wrap up now. In the future episode, I was recently talking with my mom. I'd like to come back to some of the dynamics around, and I get to have a guest on about this sometime, about some of the distinctions. Because I notice a pattern, and I'll just leave it here as a teaser for a future episode, that people who, and again, speaking generally, and this isn't universal, but I often find that the people who are Holocaust survivors have an easier time connecting with Black Lives Matter and the stories of liberation. And for the subsequent generations, it's different. It's not quite the same, but with actual Holocaust survivors, if you see the stories of them going to the actions and involving, and to be clear, there are also their descendants who are also many who are at actions and organizing things. But there's more to say there, and I think we're probably at time. So, is there anything else you want to say, Tracy, before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. Thank you, April.
Yeah, there are often action items, but I feel like there's just a lot in here to unpack and consider. So as a follow-up action, I would just invite our awesome listeners to share this with someone you know, either the actual episode itself or your summary of a component of it, and dialogue about it.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll catch you next week. Much love.
Thanks for tuning in. Our show's theme music was composed by Elliot Hammer. You can find this track and other beats on Instagram at Elliot Hammer. If this episode resonated with you, please share it and subscribe. To join the conversation, visit JewsTalkRacialJustice.com, where you can send us a question or suggestion, access our show notes, and learn more about our team. Take care until next time, and stay humble and keep going.